Welcome to the State of Cyber War, a production of the Science, Secure and Mind series of podcasts. Join us as we discuss international cybersecurity policy, information warfare, cyber defense, and how they affect the digital security of the world around us. Hi there, and welcome to the latest episode of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network's Secure and Mind State of Cyber War podcast series. My name is Salomon, and I'm here again with our fellow member and colleague, Hugo Tarrida. I'm near Barcelona. He's in Madrid, so we have the global expert panel as usual. Today, we're going to talk about a really cool and timely topic that we've been planning for quite a while, and that is subsea cables, whether voice or data, and disruption and warfare, espionage, sabotage, everything around what could possibly disrupt this piece of critical global infrastructure. So, hey, Hugo, thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Really good suggestion for a topic. It was a lot of fun to research. I think we'll jump right in, and I'll give a quick overview of what the situation is, what the background is. Hugo can then talk a bit about who the main actors are, what the overall ecosystem and infrastructure looks like, and then we'll talk about some of the major threats and incidents that have been affecting subsea cables around the world in the last couple of years, and what is likely to come in the future. So a bit of history. The first underground communications cables were laid in the second half of the 19th century. For those of you who are ship geeks, you may want to look into the history of the Great Eastern, one of the largest passenger vessels at the time, a luxury passenger liner that was built by a famous Scottish engineer, and ended its life as a cable layer. And these transatlantic telegram cables were crucial in establishing communications intercontinentally, and in bringing, for example, for the British Empire, parts of the empire closer together. And disruption and interception of underwater communications cables has a long and storied history. And I think the major first effect of this was in World War I, when a lot of these actually went through the UK, and the British were able to cut Imperial Germany off from its overseas colonies and its international communications, forcing the Germans to either send their comms over British cables, or, if they could, with the primitive state of radio at the time, over wireless. And one of the effects of this was the infamous Zimmermann telegram of World War I, where Imperial Germany famously or infamously offered the government of Mexico that if they were to attack the U.S., then neutral, they would get a slice of the United States. And of course, that did little to help sympathy for the Germans in the U.S., and was a major factor in bringing them into the war. And of course, the British, with their dominance of undersea communications, were busily listening in on this. This only grew over World War II, even though radio communications became much more prevalent. And, the growth in radio communications and especially allied, but not only code-breaking efforts of wireless radio communications were major factors in some significant allied victories, such as, the famous, Battle of Midway for the Americans, and contributed majorly to the eventual victory of the Allies in against German U-boats in the Battle of the Atlantic, even though obviously they couldn't communicate via cables. Today we're dealing much more with voice and data, primarily, but not only fiber optic. There is a huge wealth of undersea cable communications around the world. Few of them run by private companies. Hugo will talk a bit about that. Others mostly by either consortia or even governments. And the background, I think, of this podcast is not only, but to a large degree, in light of of Russian aggression in Ukraine and against Western democracies, as well as potentially, we'll go into that, Chinese espionage, but also Western democracies, interception of cable communications, sabotage by various actors, Iran, North Korea, that might have an interest in this. There was a warning from a senior official at the UK Ministry of Defence in 2017. It was by far not the first one, about the danger primarily from Russia of disruption to undersea cable communications. So we'd like to go into a little bit about, who the actors are, both on running infrastructure, as well as who could disrupt these, who could intercept these, and why and how they would do that, and what maybe we predict for the future. So Hugo, maybe if you want to an overview of what is there, what are we dealing with here?
So obviously the main actors are a bit of what people can imagine, I guess. So very big countries, the US, Russia, China, even organizations, NATO with the EU as well. Even the UK, obviously one of the original ones together with the US, connecting North America to the whole of European continent. But nowadays also there's, as you mentioned before, private companies are starting to get in. So the issue is with subsea cables, and most things are subsea, to be honest. It's heavy investment. It's very logistical, a lot of infrastructure required. Obviously that means a lot of money being spent, a lot of spending, which initially only governments could actually do because of the high budget they had. But now companies, very big companies, for example, Google, Meta, Microsoft, are starting to put aside some of the revenue they're gaining to actually invest in the subsea cables. For example, Google has around 8 subsea cables, if I'm not wrong, and has invested even a total of 29 since their beginning. Obviously, why? The reason is it's more profitable for them. Obviously, money is always one of the big issues for private companies. But still, the market is not as big as it might seem. So it's currently at around 18 billion, and it's expected to grow to like around 30 billion by 2029. But obviously,
US dollars, right?
Yeah. But obviously, this is not as much as, for example, other markets, for example, tech markets, but also even smaller companies and individual companies are much more valued and expected to earn more. For example, OpenAI, with all the AI investment and everything, it's valued at around $80 billion. So it's not as profitable, and still countries and even private companies are still investing out of money. One of the main reasons is obviously communication, staying in contact, but also, for example, for Google, one of the main reasons was data. So the fact of being able to transmit data, move it around from one continent to another much quicker and more efficiently is a big issue, and also a big focus for them. Obviously, countries are now investing a lot. There's a big issue around it. Ever since, for example, as well, the Nord Stream was attacked. There's a lot of security issues around subsea cables, subsea communications. Countries are trying to protect them, but also expand on them. There's huge amounts of cables. There's a great page which we will share in the link that shows the amount of cables that there are, which continents are connected to, countries even.
And it's actually, I'm actually glad that you mentioned Nord Stream, because even though that's a gas pipeline, there's a lot of parallels in terms of, when should we talk about subsea communication cables, and when should we just talk about subsea in connecting infrastructure in general?
Yeah, because obviously nowadays subsea cables still connect around over 90% of the whole communications and internet systems of the world, which is still a huge amount, despite what people might think that's mostly satellites and so on. So how do we defend them? But obviously, how not only defend them, but also expand them. So currently, despite what our research has told us, that it's more of a competitive market, it seems more of an oligarchy of few global companies controlling the whole, installing and creation of the subsea cable. So for example, you have Alcatel Submarine Network, which is French, Subcom, which is the American, NEC Corporation, which is Japanese, Prismian, which is Italian.
These are the installers and the maintainers rather than the operators, right? Because I mean, I was very surprised when we prepared this, and you were mentioning that Google runs their own fiber, which
exactly.
I didn't know about that. So that was kind of a cool thing to learn.
Yeah, this is more the who installs them, who actually creates them, places them, and so on. So obviously, you need a lot of logistical. Once you already have the infrastructure, the heavy initial investments, so for example, the boats, the network, and so on, it's easier to keep running. It's also surprising, there's obviously a Chinese company, which is ZTT, also in there. And how they link, how they're used, it's very strange, because you have different operators, different private companies interlinking with each other, doing different things. But obviously, the endpoint are terrestrial operators, which link for very typical, very big ones with like AT&T, Telefonica, Orange, even China Mobile. They're the ones who get all the data outside the cables and inside the cables itself. Also, then you have Google as well.
Are the operators, from what you found, are they the same? The MCIs, the KPNs, Orange, are the subsea cable operators the same as the ones that would run, for example, terrestrial data from the endpoints to, for example, urban data nodes?
For most part, yes, because they're, for example, in Spain, Telefonica was a public company, so they had all the infrastructure built publicly. So they still currently run the whole infrastructure, whether it's terrestrial or by sea. So what they do is they land and subland other companies, their usage, which is something that I imagine typically happens for other countries as well, which is due to high investment. Obviously, you need that money, that financing as well. But then obviously the issue comes on, how can you attack them? What is it? How can you protect them? Who can I even attack them? Then, well, obviously, the adversaries, the first that come to mind, the obvious ones are, once again, countries. So you have currently enemies of your own country, your point of view, might be Russia, China, Iran as well. But also, for example, you have smaller groups. You have terrorists, you have, for example, Houthi rebels and so on, which they might try to actually attack and destroy that infrastructure, but also the links, the communication, the data flow. All that issues obviously require protection, both physical, but also cyber, because obviously you can attack them by both means. So it is an issue. It is complicated on how to actually defend them, not only on how to install them, maintain them, keep them running, but also how to actually defend them from an attack. They're pretty vulnerable from different huge issues. And you will talk about it a bit afterwards. Very different ways with things can go wrong with subsea cables and communication in general, from natural things to actually just attacking them directly.
It's like any sensitive infrastructure where especially in a case like this, that's very, very far away from obviously populated centers and very, very hard to reach, 3 kilometers under the water. And one of the things that I always laughed about was, as far back as I think it's 2014 is one article I found, was that Google, a bunch of their cables were being attacked by sharks chewing on the fiber, which kind of adds another dimension to what could possibly go wrong beyond, the natural disasters, volcanoes, continental drift, that kind of thing, before we even start talking about human intervention.
Yeah, it's just the issue that so many things that can actually damage the cables. And there's also the other issue. It's very deep in the sea. How can you repair them? How long is it going to take? So a small damage can actually disconnect the whole cable for a long period of time. And something that needs to be taken into account, mainly both if you're the operator, the company, but also as the country itself. How do you want to stay connected? Meaning, for example, the West, the EU, Europe in general, to the US, to North, Central, and South America as well. How you need to keep the cables running, have backups as well. Also, take into account, for example, shark attack. You can't avoid a shark attack. It's just going to happen. You just have to prepare for it.
Well, you can, but you're going to have to pay the guy a whole lot of money. But one thing I quickly wanted to address that you quickly went into before is the valuation of the market. I don't think there's a good parallel to be drawn between, and you mentioned OpenAI, which for me is a particular, red flag, right? Because for me, that's a speculative market valuation. Whereas the subsea cable market, the data communications market is, okay, maybe it's not the world's largest, even though, 30-40 billion annual is not nothing to sneer at. But I think that comparison to, for example, a tech company, and for me, an inflated tech company valuation doesn't reflect the sheer criticality of this piece of infrastructure. I mean, basically, if we, lost a couple of the major transatlantic cables or trans-Pacific cables, yeah, the world wouldn't end. But I probably couldn't get a bunch of my Amazon stuff from China. So
yeah, but also mentioning that it is not such a big market, but it is a stable reliance of sources of company. Like, that the market's still going to be there in 20, 30 years. It might decrease a bit, might increase it's still going to be there. It's a good, reliable source of income. But also what you're talking about, just connectivity itself.
It's infrastructure. It's boring but important.
Exactly. And the keeping and maintaining of it is obviously mostly related to private companies, which obviously end up being very lucrative just by the sheer amount of work that has to be done, maintaining and protecting them.
So we have basically governments, we have consortia, we have so whether it's we have telcos, large backbone telcos, and we have some comparatively few private companies, like you mentioned Google as an example, running these, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah. No, obviously it's an issue on whoever runs them also has, from my point of view, somewhat of power over the government, because you can obviously shut it down, which might be another issue, another topic itself. But if you run the data, the cables, the communication, the links, how much can you pressure a government to do something, to change policies? Might be entering another topic, but I'll just throw it out there.
It's a good topic, and I think it's one that we one of the follow-up episodes that we thought about for this particular one was about alternatives, military communications, satellite communications, etc. I think it also depends very strongly on what government we're talking about. US, UK, France, Japan, China are going to be less likely in a position of being susceptible to blackmail, essentially, than Switzerland, right? Smaller, lesser economies. One other thing I think to touch on is just how these cables are used. There's the concept of dark fiber, which some companies use for undersea cables, which is basically a dedicated cable that's just on standby. It's for you alone. In case there's a failure in your primary link, you fail over to that. There are dedicated cables, as the Google ones. There are shared cables where you have multiple virtual circuits in that cable. And I do encourage you to look up, if you're not familiar with this, some of the, not only what the cables themselves look like, but what it looks like when these things come ashore. Because very often it's just literally just a big fat tube snaking across the beach and going into the water, which blew my mind. I didn't know what I would expect, but it didn't seem to be anything that basic.
Yeah.
So I think it kind of that's a good segue. It's good. I think to start talking about some of the different types of human let's say interventions, not just attacks, because obviously the natural disasters, the natural phenomena, hungry sharks, are always going to be that's a really good idea for a video game, by the way, in case anybody is listening. Those are always going to be kind of a background risk. And I think in this case, it bears talking about interception versus actual disruption. So obviously we touched on subsea gas and oil pipelines. So with Nord Stream, for example, Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2, there was a sabotage case in the last couple of years. And there, obviously we're talking about destruction. We're talking about sabotage. You want to cut off something. And I think in researching this podcast, for me at least, I hadn't really thought about what the motivations are of different actors. And you brought up a really good point when we were preparing about, well, cui bono, who benefits, right? Who actually benefits from destroying these things? And it became very quickly clear to me that there are different classes of actors who would benefit from disrupting versus those who would benefit from intercepting. Yeah,
I completely agree. But also, I think there's links to the motivation each actor has, and how they behave internationally as well. Obviously, might be better due to the situation if you're not at war, but you want, for example, let's say China wants to steal intellectual property. Obviously, they're not going to destroy it. They're going to infiltrate. They're going to try to get out information from that cable itself. I mean, a country that might be...
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. And then, for example, I was just going to say that another country, for example, Russia, with a war, might be more reliable, more reliant on just sabotaging communications, data flow itself. So I think it depends widely on both the situation the country is currently facing, but also the motivation, the enemy. Because in the end, you have to take into account that's damaging one cable is not going to damage one specific actor, but the whole conglomerate, whole area of different countries, states, companies, citizens as well. So it's going to have a huge impact overall.
And this is exactly the direction I wanted to go in. So I'm glad you started on that, because I mean, with China is a bit of a special case. I would argue that Chinese industrial espionage, especially, is more focused on endpoints. Your classic Chinese APT groups dancing around, let's say, American power plants or European rail networks. That they're going to be less likely, because they're also going to be less technologically sophisticated than, for example, the U.S., who are, at least in my research, from what the NSA lets us know, for me at least, the undisputed masters of tapping into subsea fiber optic cables. There's a particular U.S. nuclear submarine, the USS Jimmy Carter, that has long been at least rumored to be dedicated to a whole bunch of black ops shenanigans and skullduggery, not least of which is tapping undersea fiber optics. And the American... Yeah, please go ahead.
Let me jump in. I'd say, obviously, you just mentioned something I think is crucial within the whole debate, which is who actually has the capacity to do what.
Exactly.
Because you might be a small country which do not have the capacity to actually sabotage or infiltrate, but you can actually just destroy it, drop something on it, and that's it.
And it will. Speaking of dropping things on it, we'll get into that in a second. That was a good revelation. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think I would think maybe possibly the Chinese, maybe the Russians. I kind of doubt it. Potentially the British and potentially the Germans are the four countries that next to the US that potentially come to mind as those with some kind of motivation and technological aptitude and resources to tap into a cable. Yeah, and I think especially with the Americans and their allies in the quote unquote Western world, including Japan, Australia, etc. There's, I think, much more reliance on subsea cable communications being available than, for example, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. Yeah, because they have mostly terrestrial borders. They have land communications. They don't have these kind of far-flung overseas, alliances and dependencies that are a key part of their military and geopolitical capabilities. Does that sound reasonable?
It does. I also completely agree. And I think that pops up once again to the debate on not only who has the capacity, but also what the impact would be to whom as well. Because obviously Russia maintaining its communication with its allies will not be extremely affected if, for example, a North Atlantic cable might be destroyed or damaged. Or for example, for Europe, for the US, might be extremely crucial, extremely damaging and devastating within the whole spectrum and sphere of it.
I mean, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, it's right there in the name, So there was a Time magazine article in 1975 about the Glomar Explorer, Howard Hughes's fabled ship that was a cover story. I think the cover story was that it was doing mining exploration when really they were trying to salvage a Soviet submarine that had sunk. And there was speculation in that article that that cover story was actually designed to leak. And it was really, really a double hidden thing. I don't know what it's called in intelligence circles. And that one of the speculations was that it was actually being used to tap into Soviet undersea communications. Again, given that the Soviets weren't as reliant on as the U.S. on that. Then again, in that article, they also cited, looking for crashed UFOs and things like that, and looking for Atlantis as potential uses. So I don't know how credible that is. But again, the Jimmy Carter one was one that's what stood out, where it's reasonably credible that this submarine was deployed for this particular purpose. In 22, there were two major North Sea cables that were cut. I'm going to link to articles. There's a lot of articles on csis.org. In 2023, there was a massive damage to a Baltic Sea cable. Turned out to be a Chinese ship, and it is still not resolved what the motivation, what was actually behind this, because the story that was in all the papers was that, oops, this guy's an idiot, and he dragged an anchor across it. That said, that ship, after getting into port, very, very quickly was sent back to China. and the investigation is still open. And as far as I could tell, there's still no conclusive evidence on what actually happened, what the motivation was. One thing so there are, in on top of, these repeated warnings from militaries, from defense ministries, about, what the threats are to cables and who some of the threat actors are. Again, the main side are the Russians.
I can jump here just very quickly.
Cables. Yeah, go ahead.
Obviously, you just mentioned how organizations, military organizations, countries, so on. For example, there's an article on NATO that released how they were going to prepare to, for example, not only undersea warfare, but also protecting and maintaining subsea cables, just because of the high crucial and importance and vitality of them itself. Mm-hmm. So the fact that, for example, organizations such as NATO, just very big, lot of countries, military operations as well, are starting to change the focus, maybe not change, but start putting to the spotlight subsea cables, underwater issues, problems as well, brings an issue on, is the importance actually worse than what we thought? The probability of something going wrong, the country damaging it on purpose or by accident, someone might be an idiot and actually draw the anchor through the subsea cable, but might be on purpose as well. The issue, the problem itself, at least for me, it raises some warning and issue, how they're now openly saying it, and how, for example, they're also preparing for it as well.
Mm-hmm. I think this opens up, I think, a topic that we should touch in, and we, because we're cheapskates and we only have the free Zoom, we don't get to do eternal meetings. So I think we should probably do this in part 2. But I think this opens up the topic of subsea warfare. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to, discuss not only the concepts and potentials of undersea warfare, of infrastructure warfare, but also some of the treaty frameworks that underlie the current situation. What is sabotage? What are the penalties for accidental or intentional attacks? What does this mean in terms of military context if somebody attacks an undersea cable? And I think what I'd like to do is wrap up on a comment to your previous point, which was, if somebody can damage these things as an act of war. We saw one of the major cables in the Red Sea recently cut. It turns out it was the Houthis. And everybody been warning about, are the Houthis capable of cutting undersea cables? Turns out, yes, they are. However, what I read was that this is unintentional, because they managed to cut it by dumb luck, because they sank a cargo ship and it fell on it. So I think I would like to wrap up this first half of this episode with, does it count as an act of war if you sink an enemy ship and accidentally drop it on a piece of their critical communications infrastructure? And with that, let's wrap up this one, and we'll see you in the next episode.
See you part 2.
Thank you for joining us in this latest edition of the Secure in Mind podcast series, courtesy of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network. Visit us at cybersecurityadvisors.network/media and /blog for additional episodes and articles. Follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, SoundCloud, Podcast Republic, and iTunes, and don't hesitate to get in touch. Stay safe, stay smart, stay educated, and stay secure.